The North American aviation P-51 Mustang is an American, long-range, single-seat fighter, as well as a fighter bomber. It was used mainly during World War II and the Korean War, though they would see service in other countries and other conflicts as well. They had a length of 32 feet 3 inches, a wingspan of exactly 37 feet, a height of 13 feet 4.5 inches, and a maximum takeoff weight of 12,100 pounds. They could reach a top speed of 440 miles per hour, and had a cruise speed of 362 miles per hour. Their max range with external tanks was 1,650 miles, and they had a service ceiling of 41,900 feet. Their main armament consisted of 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns. It could also be equipped with rockets or bombs for ground attack roles. And the P-51, when it comes to the American Air Service, is one of the most iconic airplanes there is. But, interestingly, their design did not start as American at all. Well, it was developed by us, but it was at the request of the British. All the way back in 1938, the British government would establish a purchasing commission in the United States that was headed up by Sir Henry Self. He was given the responsibility of Royal Air Force production, research, and development, and served with Sir Wilfrid Freeman, who was the Air Member for Development and Production. Self also sat on the British Air Council Supply Committee, and among his tasks was organizing the manufacturing and supply of American fighter aircraft built for the RAF. But in those days, their choices weren't really that varied. There were very few US aircraft that actually met European standards. The only one that came close was the Curtiss P-40. And yeah, they could have ordered some more of those, but the problem was the Curtiss Wright plant was running at full capacity at the time, so there weren't a lot of P-40s to go around. That's where North American aviation would come in. You see, they were already supplying their T-6 Texan, which the British called the Harvard, which was a trainer, and the RAF quite liked them in that role. But North American was looking to improve their sales numbers, and their president, James Howard Dutch Kindleberger, would wind up approaching Self to sell a new medium bomber, which was their B-25 Mitchell. But the British weren't looking for a medium bomber. Self instead asked Kindleberger if North American could perhaps manufacture more P-40s, or perhaps the new P-46s that were in development, under license from Curtiss, because they were still trying to get more of those. Kindleberger was receptive to producing fighters for the British, but he didn't want to license a Curtiss design, so he told Self that his company could actually have a better aircraft, using the same engine, the Allison V-1710, in the air sooner than they could establish a production line for P-40s or P-46s. Self may have been well aware that Kindleberger may have been blowing smoke when it came to doing it faster than just establishing a production line for the existing P-40s, but the idea of a superior aircraft would certainly interest him. John Atwood, of North American, would spend a lot of time between January and April of 1940 at the British Purchasing Commission's offices in New York, trying to figure out exactly what the British wanted in an aircraft, and he would consult with the British engineers regarding their particular interests. The discussions would include a lot of freehand conceptual drawings, but Self was concerned that North American hadn't actually ever developed a fighter, and began to insist that they obtain the drawings and study the Curtiss XP-46 experimental aircraft, as well as the wind tunnel test results for the P-40, before they presented them with a detailed design. North American opted to at least try to shut Self up, and did purchase those drawings and data from Curtiss for $56,000. And while this would result in Curtiss engineers accusing North American of plagiarizing their design, the truth is that what would become the P-51 was a much different aircraft than anything Curtiss had been working on. The British Purchasing Commission wanted an aircraft that could be equipped with 4 7.7mm machine guns, and each unit was to cost no more than $40,000. Delivery of the first production aircraft was to be by January of 1941, and in March of 1940, 320 of the new aircraft were ordered by Freeman, who by that point was the executive head of the Ministry of Aircraft Production. The original plane that would eventually evolve into the P-51 that we know was referred to as the NA-73X. It was designed by a team led by the engineer Edgar Schmood, and they were being very careful to follow conventional practices of that time, and the whole plane was meant to be as easy to mass produce as possible, though it did incorporate some newer features. One, for example, were the wings, which were designed using laminar flow airfoils. Those airfoils would generate low drag at high speeds, and therefore allow the plane to go faster as a whole. The other feature was a new coaling arrangement positioned aft, which reduced fuselage drag as well as effects on the wing. They also discovered that the cooling assembly could take advantage of what was known as the Meredith effect, during which heated air exited the radiator and caused a very slight amount of thrust. The plane was actually one of the first to have a fuselage lofted mathematically, using conic sections, giving it smooth, low-drag surfaces. And to aid in production, the airframe was divided into 5 main sections: forward center, rear fuselage, as well as 2 wing halves. And all of those were fitted with wiring and piping before being joined. It was, in effect, a modular design, meaning that, in a wartime situation, which they were in, these planes could be produced very quickly. The NA-73X was rolled out in September of 1940, which was just 102 days after the order had been placed, and it first flew the following month, October 26, 1940, which was really blindingly fast in terms of developing a new plane, even during World War II. The plane was flown by test pilot Vance Breese, and it handled well with a really nice fuel load, which would become relevant for the later P-51. The 3-section fuselage was constructed entirely of aluminum to make it as light as possible, yet still strong. The British would indeed receive many of the planes. Further refinements would be made. It was also important to stress that while the NA-73 was certainly a major part of the Mustang story, it is not the same plane that would ultimately become the P-51. It is not equivalent, and while the aircraft do certainly belong in the same family, what the British wound up flying, and what America would know as their Mustang, would ultimately wind up being 2 pretty different planes, all things considered. As North America continued producing these planes for the British, several models were held back for testing with the U.S. Army Air Corps. And what was noticed by everyone that was using them was that the Allison engine, while a good engine, only had a single-stage supercharger, and that caused power to drop off rapidly when the plane was above 15,000 feet. As such, it actually wasn't suitable for use at the altitudes where a lot of combat was taking place over the European theater. Allison was trying to work on a high-altitude engine, but they were pretty underfunded in this regard. They did produce the V-1710-45, and North Americans studied the possibility of utilizing it, but it was a long engine, and fitting it inside the Mustang would require extensive airframe modifications, and cause long production delays. But in May of 1942, the RAF did like the Mustang 1 for its performance below 15,000 feet. It was really good there. And a man named Ronald Harker, who was a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, suggested the idea of fitting a different engine, a Merlin 61, into the Mustang. The Merlin 61 was the same one that the Spitfire Mark 9 used, and it had a 2-speed, 2-stage intercooled supercharger. And early on, the US military didn't have that much interest in the Mustang. While its performance was certainly interesting, and developing it for a high-altitude role might be a promising idea, it wasn't pushed that hard, though it was still tested and developed. The first flight of the American version, which was designated the XP-51B, took place in November of 1942, and P-51s did start to become available to the 8th and 9th Air Forces in the winter of 1943 and 1944. They were converted to use a Merlin engine, but not the 61. The Mustangs would use the 65, and the performance of the aircraft would speak for themselves, as the US Army would soon realize that they kinda needed something like the P-51. One of the big benefits of the Mustang was the range. With external tanks, they could actually follow bombers to their targets and back again, which no other single-engined, high-speed fighter could do. See, the pre-war doctrine was based on the idea that the bomber will always get through. Basically, the US Army Air Force thought that a tightly packed formation of bombers would have so much firepower that they could fend off fighters on their own. And they still were in that line of thinking by 1942, but the RAF and the Luftwaffe both had realized by that point that was wrong. That was a very, very bad idea. Enough fighters would totally waste bomber squadrons, and many believed a fighter of the size of a Mustang, but with the range of a bomber, was an engineering impossibility. Which, no, it is not. When the 8th Air Force started operations from Britain in August of 1942, at first, it seemed like sending the bombers off on their own was actually alright. By the end of the year, the loss rate was under 2%, so they were doing just fine. But over time, the Luftwaffe would adapt, and soon that loss rate would multiply heavily. As a result, the very concept of self-defending bombers was being called into question. They tried converting some of the bombers to gunships, but that didn't work. And then they tried using the Lockheed P-38, the Lightning, which were very good planes. But as two engines, they weren't quite as agile. After evaluating alternatives, the P-51B was considered to be the best option, as they had very high flight endurance. With their external fuel tanks, they could fly for 4 hours and 45 minutes, able to follow the bombers just fine. And the Mustang proved to be an excellent aircraft in this particular role. Besides the fact that they could actually follow the bombers for the entirety of their mission, but they were also extremely good planes with very good performance that could go toe-to-toe with the best the Luftwaffe had. Plus, they used a common, reliable engine, making maintenance a lot easier. And remember, the precursors had been designed to be as easy to manufacture as possible, and the P-51s were no different. They still were able to be assembled very quickly. In fact, the Mustang was so obviously better than earlier American-designed planes that the 8th Air Force began to switch its fighter groups to the Mustang entirely. And by the end of 1944, 14 of their 15 groups all flew Mustangs. The Luftwaffe was sending up Messerschmitt Bf-110 heavy fighters to deal with bombers, but these were not a match for Mustangs at all. To the point that the Luftwaffe just straight up stopped sending them. They had to withdraw them. The Mustangs were too much. The Focke-Wulf 190s could go toe-to-toe with them at low altitude, but the 190As were suffering from very poor high-altitude performance, whereas the Mustang with their new Merlins could handle flying at the B-17's altitude, as well as maneuvering and fighting. As such, they would outperform the 190s in pretty much every regard, too. The Bf-109 did have comparable performance at high altitudes, but they were very light, and were greatly affected by the increase in armament they needed to actually take out bombers. The Mustangs in these formations weren't equipped for bomber hunting. They were equipped for anti-fighter duties, and as such, they could completely outmaneuver the 109s as well. The design of the P-51 would also be continuously improved, the apex of it generally being considered the P-51D, and they would see service over the Pacific theater as well. They were easily one of the best planes of the war. It's just funny to think they probably never would have had them if the British hadn't asked for a plane like them early on. And yet we did, and they helped carry the Allied war effort forward. 2 pilots would actually receive the Medal of Honor flying these planes. James H. Howard of the 356th Fighter Squadron and the 354th Fighter Group was awarded it for his action during a bomber escort mission in Germany on January 11th, 1944. He was flying a B model, and he found himself completely outnumbered. Instead of running away, he shot down 3 of the German planes and continued to defend the bombers even when his guns went out of action, and his fuel supply was dangerously low. Major William A. Shomo of the 82nd Reconnaissance Squadron, 71st Reconnaissance Group, was also awarded the medal for his actions over the Philippines on July 11, 1945. His model was the F-6D, which was the armed photo reconnaissance variant of the Mustang. Despite being on a reconnaissance mission, he shot down 7 Japanese planes, becoming an ace in a day. The Mustangs were well liked by their crews, they were well liked by the military, they were pretty well liked in general, and they would last past the end of World War II in service. While jets were coming into the fold, P-51s were still considered useful, and they'd also be redesignated to F-51s instead, as a part of the new designation scheme for the United States Air Force. They were still the same planes either way, though. The F-51s would indeed see combat during the Korean War, being utilized mostly for ground attack roles, as well as photo reconnaissance, rather than being interceptors or pure fighters, as again, by that point, jets were starting to be relevant, and could outperform the P-51s in terms of speed, but not in terms of range. The 51s could hit targets in Korea that the American jets couldn't. They just couldn't reach them. However, the P-51s were becoming a lot more vulnerable to more modern defenses. They started sustaining heavy losses to ground fire. Another pilot of the plane was awarded the Medal of Honor during that conflict as well. On August 5th, 1950, Major Louis J. Sibyl of the 67th Fighter Bomber Squadron attacked a North Korean armored column that was advancing on United Nations military units during the Battle of Pusan Perimeter. His aircraft was heavily damaged by that point, and he himself was wounded during the first pass. But he turned his plane around and decided to go full kamikaze on them. He crashed his Mustang intentionally into the convoy, costing him his life, but he would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. And even after that conflict was over, the Mustangs still stuck around for at least a little bit. They would fly in the Air Force Reserve throughout the 1950s, and the last American Mustang was an F-51D, and she was withdrawn from service with the West Virginia Air National Guard's 167th Fighter Interceptor Squadron in January of 1957. But that wasn't the end for these amazing planes. For one thing, they were sold abroad, and many saw service in so many other countries. No, you don't understand. More than 25 nations would utilize some version of the Mustang, and they were produced in very high numbers initially, even just for America. More than 15,000 of these planes were built, and when they were retired, that threw hundreds of them into the civilian market. Many 51s were sold as surplus even right after the war, sometimes for as little as $1,500. Can I buy a Mustang for that amount in the modern day, right now? Because I will. This is one of those planes I would love to own someday. That's the price, absolutely. And due to their fame and prevalence, it means that they're often seen at air shows. Pretty much, if you go to any air show in America, there's at least one Mustang just chillin'. They've seen an insane amount of preservation, like in the hundreds, which is nearly unheard of for any historical vehicle. And some have even produced scale replicas, because, why not? It's the Mustang. This is America's baby. The true American aircraft. To do American things like winning world wars. For America. Even though it was contracted by the British initially. America! But regardless of any of that, I think what I can definitely say is that I certainly hope Mustangs continue to fly for many years to come. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panther Kitchen 131-232, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Brian, Jack Carson's Row of Videos, Lord Off 444, Mark Holding, Murder Drone Stall, A Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Royal Hudson's 1860, Isaac for 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Ohio Trucker 1, Joshua Long, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Hayden DeGrow, Caleb Rainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Arizona Hot Rail, Liam Wright, Mr. Sleepy, and Dr. Racer 78. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.